The story of the Ford Probe GT begins long before the car itself reached showrooms, rooted in an era when Ford was desperately trying to modernize its lineup and align itself with the rapidly changing tastes of global drivers. In the early to mid-1980s, the American automotive industry was still recovering from fuel crises, shifting regulations, and the growing influence of Japanese manufacturers whose cars were lighter, more efficient, more refined, and increasingly popular with younger buyers. Ford realized that the future might not be in the traditional formula of big engines, rear-wheel drive, and muscular styling. Instead, the company became fascinated with aerodynamics, platform-sharing efficiency, and the rising potential of high-tech front-wheel drive performance. Out of this corporate introspection came an idea that, at the time, seemed bold enough to redefine Ford's identity. Replace the aging Mustang with an entirely new, more modern coupe built on a joint platform with Mazda. While this plan sparked outrage among Mustang loyalists, so much so that Ford ultimately abandoned the idea, the engineering work that had already begun was too promising to discard. Thus, the Probe project took shape, carrying the DNA of what might have been a new kind of Mustang, but instead becoming its own distinct creation. As Ford and Mazda deepened their collaboration, the Probe GT inherited a platform co-developed with a Japanese automaker, leveraging Mazda's excellence in lightweight engineering, tight chassis tuning, and smooth, high-revving engines. Ford's designer sculpted a sleek, wedge-like body, heavily influenced by wind tunnel testing, with aerodynamic lines that contrasted sharply with the boxy shapes dominating American roads. Pop-up headlights, integrated bumpers, smooth curves, and futuristic details created an impression of a car that was almost ahead of its time. When the first-generation Probe GT debuted in 1988, its turbocharged 2.2-liter Mazda-derived engine immediately set apart in a market that was just beginning to explore the potential of turbocharged four-cylinders. The GT model wasn't simply a styling package. It came with more power, sport-tuned suspension, larger wheels, and performance-oriented features that place it firmly in the realm of affordable high-tech sports coupes. The early reception was enthusiastic. Automotive journalists praised the car for its agility, its willingness to push through corners with confidence, and its impressive balance between performance and everyday usability. Buyers who walked into Ford showrooms expecting a domestic-feeling coupe were often shocked by how refined and precise it felt, something clearly influenced by Mazda's engineering philosophy. The Probe GT's driving experience had a distinctly international character, smoother and more controlled than many American alternatives, and in some ways closer to a European or Japanese sports coupe. It offered a modern, futuristic driving environment as well, with some trims featuring digital displays, wraparound dashboards, and control layouts designed to make the driver feel like they were piloting something more technologically advanced than its price tag suggested. But the Probe GT's origin as a near replacement for the Mustang left it with a unique, almost conflicted identity. It carried the ambition of a future Ford envisioned, one filled with efficient, global, collaborative performance machines, but existed within a company still rooted in V8 tradition. The Probe was never meant to be a niche experiment. Ford had imagined it becoming a mainstream successor to an American icon. Even after plans changed, the car retained the spirit of that ambitious goal: bold styling, advanced engineering, and a vision of what the next generation of sporty coupes could be. Its arrival reflected a moment when Ford dared to challenge its own history, embracing a new direction shaped by international influence and forward-looking technology. Yet this boldness also set the stage for the conflicts, challenges, and misunderstandings that would later shape the Probe GT's fate, as the car entered a market that wasn't yet ready to fully embrace the future it represented. As the Probe GT settled into the market after its initial debut, its situation became increasingly complicated, shaped by forces both inside and outside Ford that the company did not fully anticipate. The late 80s and early 90s marked a dramatic shift in the automotive landscape, a time when consumer tastes were evolving faster than manufacturers could adapt. The sporty coupe segment, once thriving thanks to cars like the Mustang, Camaro, Prelude, Celica, and the early turbo imports, suddenly became a fragmented battlefield. Buyers who wanted performance were dividing into sharply different groups, each with very specific expectations. Traditional American performance fans gravitated toward rear-wheel drive muscle, craving the growl of a V8 and the aggressive styling that came with decades of heritage. These customers looked at the Probe GT, front-wheel drive, small displacement engines, and Japanese-derived engineering, and felt that it was too refined, too modern, too far removed from the raw, traditional formula they associated with American performance. To them, the Probe GT didn't feel like a spiritual successor to Mustang, but rather like a car built for a completely different demographic. On the other side of the spectrum, import enthusiasts were beginning to form a culture of their own, marking the rise of tuners, compact performance builds, and a preference for machines with a reputation for reliability, high-revving engines, and engineering purity. This audience admired the Mazda MX-6 and Honda Prelude for their precision, and saw Toyota and Mitsubishi stepping forward with increasingly sophisticated technology, like four-wheel steering and turbocharged all-wheel drive configurations. Even though the Probe GT shared its core engineering with Mazda, one of the most respected Japanese automakers, it carried the Ford badge, and that alone caused skepticism among those who wanted a fully Japanese identity in their vehicles. For these buyers, the Probe existed in an awkward middle space, not American enough for muscle car fans, not Japanese enough for import purists, and not established enough to command brand loyalty. Ford tried to appeal to both groups, but the car ended up appealing deeply to a smaller, more nuanced audience that appreciated its hybrid identity, an audience not large enough to drive huge sales numbers. Meanwhile, competition intensified at an unprecedented pace. Honda refined the Prelude into a masterpiece of balance and engineering. Toyota pushed the Celica toward both rally-inspired versions and stylish GT models, and Mitsubishi shook the segment with the turbocharged Eclipse and its all-wheel drive variants. Even Nissan had offerings like the 240SX that captured enthusiasts seeking rear-drive dynamics. Each of these cars had a clear identity. The Prelude was a precise driver's machine, the Celica was reliable and stylish, the Eclipse was the turbocharged thrill-seeker's choice, and the 240SX was the drifting and tuning enthusiast's dream. The Probe GT, despite being talented in many areas, struggled to define itself as a car for any one specific niche. It handled beautifully, but not as razor-sharp as a Prelude. It offered strong engines, but not the tuner-friendly turbo platforms that Eclipse fans loved. It had styling that was futuristic, but didn't develop the cult following of Japanese designs. Compounding these market pressures was the fact that Ford itself wasn't entirely sure how aggressively to position the Probe GT. The company was still hesitant to fully embrace it as a flagship sporty model because the Mustang commanded so much heritage-driven loyalty. Marketing dollars flowed heavily toward the Mustang, especially as Ford prepared for the major SN95 overhaul. The Probe GT was featured in advertisements, but without the emotional narrative or iconic identity that the Mustang enjoyed. At dealerships, salespeople often guided performance-minded customers toward the Mustang simply because it was easier to sell, easier to describe, and aligned with long-standing expectations about what a Ford performance car should be. The Probe GT, while highly capable, needed more explanation, more context, more time to win people over, and in a dealership environment, that often meant it was overlooked. All these factors combined to create a dynamic in which the Probe GT existed as something of an outlier, an excellent car caught in a cultural and commercial tug-of-war. It was too forward-thinking for customers who wanted tradition, too unconventional for those chasing pure import authenticity, and too overshadowed within its own brand to stand as a flagship. Ford had hoped it would capture a new generation of drivers, but instead, the market around it was diverging into categories the Probe was never perfectly aligned with. Its engineering brilliance, aerodynamic design, and modern approach were recognized by reviewers. Yet the era's rapidly changing tastes, rising competition, and brand identity conflicts kept it from fully taking hold in the mainstream. Instead of becoming the bold new direction Ford envisioned, the Probe GT became a niche favorite, respected by those who understood it, but misunderstood by the masses who didn't know exactly where it fit in the shifting automotive world. When the second-generation Ford Probe GT arrived for the 1993 model year, it marked a dramatic transformation in the car's design philosophy and engineering execution, representing the peak of what Ford and Mazda could achieve together in the era just before global platform sharing became the industry norm. Everything about the new Probe GT was more fluid, more sculpted, and more cohesive than the first generation. The bodywork abandoned the wedge-like sharpness of the late 80s and embraced a sweeping, organic shape, a look that felt futuristic, almost European. with curves that blended seamlessly into one another. The car sat lower, with a more aggressive stance and a sleeker nose, while the pop-up headlights remained as a playful, aerodynamic flourish. Even the greenhouse was reshaped to improve visibility and reduce drag, giving the car an almost concept car aura. Inside, the cockpit was redesigned with a wraparound feel, angling controls toward the driver, while materials improved noticeably. Critics noted that the interior refinement and ergonomics felt surprisingly sophisticated for a $20,000 sports coupe, and much of that came directly from Mazda's influence on design and layout. Under the hood, the Probe GT received what would become the heart and soul of its identity, the Mazda-built KLD 2.5-liter V6. This engine was renowned for its smoothness, its willingness to rev, its balance of refinement and power, and its warm, almost musical tone at higher RPMs, producing 164 horsepower, an impressive figure for a naturally aspirated V6 in the early 90s. The KLD made the Probe GT feel alive and responsive in a way the Turbo 4 of the previous generation never fully captured. What made the engine special wasn't just power, but character. It delivered its strength linearly across the rev range, encouraging spirited driving without ever feeling harsh or strained. Owners and reviewers alike often remarked that the engine felt like something you'd expect from a more expensive European car, and its reliability record over decades has only enhanced that reputation. The handling of the second-generation Probe GT was equally memorable, benefiting from Mazda's expertise in suspension tuning and chassis balance. The car rode on a well-engineered platform shared with the MX-6, which already had a reputation for being one of the most cohesive front-wheel drive performance cars of time. The Probe GT suspension featured precise geometry that allowed it to rotate willingly through corners, offering a sense of agility that surprised drivers unfamiliar with Mazda's engineering prowess. Ford enhanced this with specific tuning for American roads, slightly softer than the MX-6 in some aspects, but more controlled at higher speeds, resulting in a car that felt planted on the highway yet nimble on winding roads. Reviewers consistently praised the Probe GT's ability to carve corners with confidence, often placing it at or near the top of comparison tests. Its steering was light but communicative, and the combination of the KLD V6 with a well-matched manual transmission created a driving experience that felt matured, polished, and rewarding. Despite its performance strengths, the Probe GT found itself struggling to translate critical acclaim into strong sales. One problem was that Ford itself was entering a period of expanding product lines and shifting priorities. With the Explorer becoming a runaway success, the Taurus dominating the family sedan market, and the Mustang's heritage securing its place as Ford's primary performance icon, the Probe quickly found itself playing the role of a middle child. Ford's marketing efforts leaned heavily toward the Mustang, especially with the 1994 SN95 generation arriving just 1 year after the new Probe GT, leaving the Probe position as the other sporty coupe in the showroom. Customers walking into Ford dealerships to buy a performance car were usually already dreaming of a Mustang, not a front-wheel drive global platform experiment. Sales teams knew the Mustang was the easier pitch, the easier emotional sell, and the easier financing close, so the Probe GT often sat quietly to the side, admired by those who noticed it, but rarely pushed aggressively by sales staff. At the same time, market preferences were evolving. The early 90s saw the rise of performance sedans like the Mitsubishi Galant VR, Ford Nissan Maximus E, and later the Honda Accord V6, cars that offered speed and handling without sacrificing practicality. SUVs, too, were rapidly becoming mainstream, shifting customers away from coupes altogether. Younger enthusiasts were increasingly drawn to tuner-friendly imports with huge aftermarket support. Civics, Integras, Eclipses, and 240SXs. The Probe GT, though excellent in stock form, lacked the vast modification culture that made these cars explode in popularity. It appealed most strongly to drivers who appreciated its balanced, refined character, but that group was not large enough to sustain booming sales. Yet for all these challenges, those who drove the second-generation Probe GT understood immediately that they were experiencing something special. It was a car that struck an unusually mature balance between comfort and excitement. It could be a daily commuter on weekdays, quiet and smooth enough for long trips, and then transform into a spirited back-row performer on weekends. The combination of Ford's bold styling and Mazda's engineering precision resulted in a driving experience that was distinctly international, something rare for an American coupe of the era. Its chassis, engine, suspension, and design formed a cohesive whole, a car that didn't need gimmicks or brute force to impress. In many ways, the second-generation Probe GT represented the height of Ford and Mazda's collaboration, a true example of what global engineering partnerships could achieve before the industry fully embraced worldwide platform strategies. Ultimately, the Probe GT's brilliance made its lack of mass-market success even more tragic. It wasn't a flawed car. It was a misunderstood one, positioned at a time when consumer interests were shifting toward entirely different kinds of vehicles. It excelled in nearly every measurable way, yet struggled to fit neatly into the narrative of what buyers expected from Ford or from sporty coupes in general. Its identity as a globally engineered, refined, front-wheel drive performance car confused traditionalists and failed to fully capture import enthusiasts. Still, the second-generation Probe GT left an undeniable mark. It demonstrated what front-drive sports coupe could be when engineering harmony, bold styling, and a high-revving V6 came together with purpose and ambition. It was a car ahead of its time, something that would only be fully appreciated decades later as enthusiasts began to rediscover the forgotten gems of the 1990s. As the years progressed after the second-generation Probe GT's release, the forces working against it became more complex than simple sales numbers or marketing decisions. Its fate was shaped by deep internal shift within Ford and by changing global automotive realities that eroded the very foundation on which the Probe had been built. Inside Ford, the early 90s were marked by a sweeping reevaluation of how the company operated, what it prioritized, and how it wanted to position itself in the future. The partnership with Mazda had produced excellent cars, but it also created internal tension. Many within Ford questioned why some of its most refined platforms, engines, and driving dynamics were coming from another manufacturer. There was a growing corporate desire to reassert Ford's identity and reduce reliance on shared platforms that muddled brand differentiation. The Probe GT, built on a Mazda platform, powered by Mazda engines, and tuned with Mazda engineering philosophy, became increasingly difficult to justify in a company striving to unify its global identity. Executives wanted products that felt undeniably Ford, and the Probe, for all its virtues, was often seen as a Mazda in Ford clothing, an idea that didn't fit with the company's long-term strategic goals. At the same time, demographic changes were reshaping the market for sporty coupes. The same young buyers who embraced compact Japanese performance cars in the late 80s were aging into family-focused stages of life, moving towards sedans, minivans, and eventually SUVs. The next wave of younger buyers, the ones Ford hoped would pick up the Probe GT, were gravitating not toward sophisticated, well-balanced coupes, but toward cars with enormous aftermarket potential. Vehicles like the Honda Civic, Acura Integra, and Mitsubishi Eclipse offered blank canvases for customization, modification, and tuning, allowing enthusiasts to create identities around their cars. The Probe GT, although brilliant in stock form, simply didn't inspire the same kind of tuner culture. Its unique Mazda V6 had limited aftermarket support. The car's electronics weren't as mod-friendly, and its front-wheel drive layout, while excellent from an engineering standpoint, didn't appeal to aspiring drifters or horsepower chasers who wanted rear-wheel drive or turbocharged platforms. In a culture that increasingly valued personalization and performance potential over well-rounded factory tuning, the Probe GT found itself out of step with the direction youth car culture was taking. Meanwhile, economic and insurance realities added another layer of difficulty. Insurance companies began categorizing sporty coupes as higher-risk vehicles, causing premiums to rise sharply for younger drivers, the very group Ford needed to attract. At the same time, interest rates fluctuated, and economic pressures made buyers more cautious with discretionary spending. Families were gravitating toward SUVs like Ford's own Explorer, which offered practicality, safety, a commanding driving position, and a lifestyle-oriented image that coupes simply couldn't match. Sporty two-door cars were declining in popularity not because they became less appealing, but because the American lifestyle was shifting rapidly, and the Probe GT didn't align with the new definition of what buyers perceived as useful or desirable. Inside Ford dealerships, the Probe GT found itself in an even more challenging position. Salespeople understood the Mustang's legacy and could effortlessly sell it through emotion, nostalgia, and brand loyalty. The Mustang's recent redesign gave it momentum and showroom presence, making it the natural choice for anyone wanting a performance car. When customers walked in undecided between the Mustang and the Probe GT, the Mustang almost always won. Not because it was inherently better, but because its identity was clear, familiar, and deeply rooted in American culture. The Probe GT required education, explanation, and a nuanced understanding of its strengths, qualities that clashed with the fast-paced reality of dealership sales. Even when the Probe GT impressed buyers during test drives, it often lost the final decision simply because the Mustang had decades of myth and emotional attachment behind it. Ford's broader strategic shift compounded this situation further. As the company realized the global coupe market was shrinking, it began investing more heavily in vehicles that promised higher volume and long-term profitability. SUVs, trucks, family sedans, and their expanding lineup of front-wheel drive mainstream cars. The Probe, being a specialty vehicle that sold in modest numbers, was gradually deprioritized. Ford internal development teams were now focused on next-generation platforms, emissions compliance, safety improvements, and restructuring their global production strategy. Within this evolving framework, a front-wheel drive sports coupe with Japanese engineering roots had little room to thrive. By the mid-1990s, decisions were being made not about how to improve the Probe GT, but about how to phase out its platform and replace it with a product that aligned better with Ford's long-term vision. All of these factors created a perfect storm around the Probe GT, a rapidly changing market, shifting buyer priorities, the decline of sporty coupes, rising competition, internal corporate restructuring, and an identity challenge that Ford never fully resolved. The Probe GT became emblematic of a transitional moment in automotive history, a time when manufacturers were torn between tradition and modernity, between global collaboration and brand purity, between emotional performance and practical utility. It was a car born from ambition and forward-thinking design, but gradually caught in currents that pulled in every direction except the one that would support it. In the end, the Probe GT didn't fade because it lacked merit. It faded because the world around it changed faster than Ford could adapt, and because it was too unique, too complex, and too forward-thinking to neatly fit into the automotive identity Ford was trying to build in the mid-1990s. As Ford moved deeper into the mid-1990s, the conversation surrounding the future of the Probe GT became less about how to refine the model and more about whether it even fit into the company's evolving product strategy at all. Early sketches, feasibility studies, and conceptual discussions surrounding a potential third-generation Probe existed. Design teams explored sleeker shapes, more advanced aerodynamics, and even speculated about new Mazda-based platforms that could support updated engines and chassis improvements. Some proposals imagined a more powerful version of the beloved KL Series V6, while others considered turbocharged four-cylinder possibilities to compete with a new wave of boosted imports. Designers toyed with even more futuristic body lines, larger wheels, and interiors inspired by high-end Japanese and European coupes. A handful of these ideas made it to clay models or internal presentations, but none survived the rapidly changing priorities inside Ford's corporate walls. Every year that passed made the Probe's future less certain, until development dollars shifted decisively elsewhere, leaving the theoretical third-generation Probe to become an obscure footnote, and eventually a forgotten what-if in Ford's internal archives. Around the same time, Ford began redirecting its sporty car ambitions toward new global strategies that emphasized cost efficiency, brand clarity, and platform consolidation. Company executives were determined to tighten Ford's corporate identity, which meant trimming vehicles that created overlap or confusion within the lineup. The Probe, sharing so much DNA with Mazda's MX-6, clashed with Ford's desire for cars that felt undeniably Ford from the ground up. Additionally, the Mustang's unexpected renaissance following its 1994 SN95 redesign refocused Ford performance marketing. The Mustang had reasserted itself as the company's undisputed halo coupe, a role Ford had once hoped the Probe might claim in a future world dominated by modern, efficient front-wheel drive designs. With Mustang sales surging and cultural enthusiasm revitalized, there was little incentive to pour resources into another sporty coupe that might only dilute the Mustang spotlight. It was an ironic twist. The Probe was originally born from an attempt to modernize and replace the Mustang, but the Mustang's reemergence ultimately showed Ford that it didn't need a modern replacement. It needed to embrace its heritage. Ford also faced complicated financial pressures that influenced which projects lived or died. The Probe GT, never a mass-market bestseller, did not justify the investment needed to create a third-generation successor, especially at a time when the industry was pivoting hard toward more profitable vehicles. SUVs were exploding in popularity. Minivans still dominated family segments, and performance sedans were becoming the new choice for buyers seeking speed without sacrificing practicality. The Explorer in particular was rewriting Ford's financial future, pulling in profit margins that no sporty coupe could ever hope to match. With the Probe selling modestly in the market for two-door cars shrinking steadily, Ford's financial planners had no difficulty marking the Probe platform for retirement. It wasn't personal, and it wasn't even reflective of the Probe's engineering quality. It was simply a matter of numbers. Even if a third-generation Probe had been developed, it would have entered a market that no longer favored its segment, making a financial risk Ford wasn't willing to take. In the meantime, Ford had already begun preparing the Probe's spiritual successor, the Ford Cougar, sold internationally as the Mercury Cougar, a front-wheel drive sporty hatch coupe based on Ford's CDW27 platform, shared with the Contour and Mondeo. The Cougar was intended to be a more cohesive global product, cheaper to produce, easier to market, and more consistent with Ford's renewed brand vision. It represented a shift away from reliance on Mazda platforms and toward Ford's own global engineering. But even the Cougar, with its sharp new edge styling and ambitious positioning, struggled in the same unstable coupe market that had challenged the Probe GT. It lasted only a few years before meeting the same fate, illustrating that the issue wasn't the Probe specifically. It was the entire market segment collapsing under the weight of shifting consumer priorities. By 1997, the Probe GT quietly ended its production run. There were no dramatic farewell editions, no celebratory ads, no special send-offs. It wasn't discontinued because it failed. It was discontinued because the world it was built for no longer existed. Ford moved on swiftly, redirecting manufacturing capacity and development budgets towards safer, more profitable ventures. Employees who had worked on the Probe either shifted to other projects or transitioned into new roles within the company's reorganized engineering structure. On dealership floors, the Probe slowly disappeared from brochures and showroom inventory, overshadowed by the rising prominence of SUVs and the continued glory of a Mustang. The Probe GT's departure was so understated that many enthusiasts didn't even realize it was gone until years later. It simply drifted out of the public eye without the recognition its engineering brilliance deserved. Yet in that silence lay an important truth. The Probe GT was not a victim of poor quality, weak performance, or a flawed concept. It was a casualty of an industry pivoting toward practicality and profit, of internal strategies that prioritize brand purity over collaborative experimentation, and a market that no longer embraced coupes unless they were tied to heritage nameplates like the Mustang or Camaro. The Probe GT, born from bold ambition and technological experimentation, was ultimately retired because the automotive world had changed, and Ford was forced to change with it. After the Probe GT's quiet exit from Ford's lineup, the car slipped into a peculiar kind of cultural twilight, neither forgotten nor celebrated, but hovering in a space reserved for vehicles that were excellent yet misunderstood in their own time. Unlike icons that receive instant classic status, the Probe GT entered the used car world without fanfare, its value dropping rapidly as the market drifted away from coupes in general. For several years, it became the kind of car you might see parked behind a small-town mechanic's shop, sitting in a classified ad for far less than its engineering deserved, or owned by someone who appreciated it without fully realizing the car's significance. This was a period when the Probe GT risked becoming just another relic of the 90s, a stylish, capable machine overshadowed by changing tastes and forgotten by a mainstream audience that had once praised its handling and design. But over time, something interesting began to happen. The very characteristics that once made the Probe GT difficult to categorize started becoming the reasons people rediscovered it. As automotive culture moved into the 2000s and 2010s, a wave of nostalgia began forming around 80s and 90s cars, vehicles from an era when designers and engineers weren't afraid to experiment. The public started looking back at cars that were once overlooked, appreciating their quirks, their bold styling, and the purity of their analog engineering compared to the increasingly digital, software-dominated vehicles emerging in the modern era. The Probe GT fit perfectly into this growing appreciation for forgotten gems. Enthusiasts began to recognize that its Mazda Source V6 was one of the smoothest and most charismatic engines ever put into a front-wheel drive sporty coupe. They began to appreciate the clean, organic lines of the second-generation design, the pop-up headlights that symbolize an era now gone, the cockpit-like interior, the way the car felt cohesive and intentional in every aspect of its engineering. Owners who kept their cars in good condition started sharing stories online about the Probe GT's reliability, its surprising cornering capability, and the joy of revving the KLD V6 to its musical upper range. Suddenly, the Probe GT wasn't just a used car. It was becoming a piece of automotive history. This slow resurgence of interest also came from car enthusiasts who had grown tired of the escalating costs and hype surrounding classic Japanese sports cars. While Supras, RX-7s, 300ZXs, and Integras skyrocketed in value, the Probe GT remained accessible, offering many of the same era-defining characteristics at a fraction of the price. Collectors began to realize that the Probe GT represented something unique, a collaboration between two major automakers at a time when such partnerships were less common and more experimental. The car served as a snapshot of what the industry looked like before global platforms and standardized designs became the norm. People began to appreciate how much personality the Probe GT had. Its blend of American style and Japanese engineering, the balance it struck between comfort and performance, and the way it captured a transitional chapter in Ford's history. It wasn't a pure muscle car or a pure import. It was something in between, something that didn't exist before and hasn't been replicated since. The growing online communities dedicated to preserving lesser-known 90s cars further helped revive the Probe GT's reputation. Forums, social media groups, meetups, and YouTube projects introduced a new generation to the car, documenting restorations, modifications, and long-term ownership stories. These digital spaces allowed enthusiasts to share technical knowledge, source rare parts, and elevate the Probe GT's status from obscurity to cult admiration. Younger automotive fans, many of whom were born after the Probe's production run ended, began to view it as a cool, retro alternative to mainstream 90s imports. The Probe GT's unique look and underdog story made it appealing to enthusiasts seeking individuality. In an era where many modern cars look and feel similar, the Probe's distinctiveness became a virtue rather than a liability. Its pop-up headlights and aerodynamic curves gave it the kind of nostalgic flair that enthusiasts increasingly cherish. At the same time, the Probe GT started gaining recognition in broader automotive discussions. Writers, vloggers, and historians revisiting the era began including it in lists of undervalued classics, forgotten performance cars, and collaborative engineering successes. Some highlighted the Probe as an example of how market timing, not engineering quality, can determine a car's fate. Others noted that the Probe GT represented a moment when Ford was willing to challenge its own traditions, embracing a global approach to performance long before that became industry standard. This growing acknowledgement helped reshape the Probe GT's legacy, transforming from a car overshadowed by the Mustang into a symbol and ambitious but misunderstood chapter in Ford's evolution. Today, the Probe GT stands as a reminder that not every great car becomes an icon in its own time. Some require distance, perspective, and a new generation to reveal what made them special. The Probe GT's legacy grows stronger each year because people now understand it in a way they couldn't when it was new. It has become a symbol of innovation ahead of its time, a bridge between American bravado and Japanese precision, and a testament to the power of engineering collaboration. What ultimately happened to the Ford Probe GT was not failure, but transformation. From a commercially misunderstood product to a beloved cult classic whose value lies not in mass-market success, but in the devotion of those who recognize what it truly was. It is a car that needed decades to be appreciated, and now, finally, it is receiving the recognition it always deserved.